In the summer months of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was under the influence of both scorching heat and difficult times. In the open marketplaces, sacks of grain were dwindling, and bread prices were rising due to the previous year's poor harvest. People were trying to heal the wounds of recent famines and epidemic diseases. The great pox disease, as feared as the plague, was rampant in the city, spreading invisible terror into everyone's hearts. Yet life continued with all its ordinariness. In the narrow streets stretching along the Ill River, a tributary of the Rhine, craftsmen opened their stalls, and children played games in the shadows of half-timber-bird houses. That summer, I was a resident of an ordinary neighborhood in Strasbourg, in my late 20s. In this city where I was born and raised, I knew every curve of the cobblestone streets by heart. Despite my tired shoulders, every morning I would lift the shutters of my shop and sell freshly ground flour to customers. Although there was an indefinite anxiety within me, I tried to remain hopeful. Because as the people of Strasbourg, we had learned to endure pain and to purify ourselves from troubles by having fun together. After difficult days, people would find ways to be happy with small things. In the evenings, neighbors would gather at doorsteps. One would play the mandolin, another would hum an old folk tune. Young people, and even adults, would sometimes get caught up in this music and dance quietly. Dancing meant joy and unity in Strasbourg's culture. While established families glided in salons with noble bassadanza steps, workers and peasants would hop and jump enthusiastically beside beer barrels. In short, dance was normally a sign of celebration, of life continuing. But that summer, the weather was hotter and more oppressive than usual. An unusual tension could be sensed on people's faces. Sunday services at the church were more crowded than usual, and priests preached patience and repentance in their sermons. The feast of St. Vitus had just passed. Many people had lit candles and prayed to the statue of this saint, whom they believed to be the protector of dancers. Deep down, everyone was seeking divine consolation for the difficulties in their lives, perhaps hoping for an approaching miracle. Who could have known that the strange miracle that would soon shake the entire city was actually waiting at our door as a terrible trial? My sister Katerina and I were living our lives doing our daily work in this restless calm. Katerina was 17 years old, a vivacious young girl. One of her favorite things was dancing to music. In the evenings, she would spin around by herself in our house's courtyard, and her laughter would flutter in the air along with the circle of her skirt. Her joy would fill our home like sunlight during our gloomy times. However, fate was about to introduce this young girl who was so passionate about dancing, and our entire city, to a completely different face of dance. One morning that summer, even in the cool hours of the day, the air was heavy and stagnant. It was obvious that the heat would be oppressive. Katerina and I were going to buy bread from the bakery. As we walked through the narrow streets, we first heard the rhythm of footsteps. At first, we thought this was a sound coming from the nearby blacksmith. But when we turned around, we saw a middle-aged woman spinning and dancing by herself in the middle of the street. I knew this woman. She was known in the neighborhood as Frau Trophia, usually a quiet, reserved person. Now she was spinning, striking her feet rapidly on the stone pavement, waving her arms at strange angles. There was neither music nor celebration. It was as if she had been caught up in an inaudible melody within herself. At first, we didn't know what to do. A few more people had begun to gather around. Some watched with curious glances, others with concern. When we approached, we could make out the expression on the woman's face. Her eyes were empty and distant, as if looking into another realm. Her face was drenched with sweat. The veins on her forehead had become prominent. She was making a sound as if mumbling to herself, but what she was saying was incomprehensible. Katerina grabbed my arm and whispered, "Is this woman all right? Should we help?" I didn't know what to say. Because Frau Trophia didn't seem like someone in good health, but at the same time trying to stop her could be dangerous. A little later, a man whom I assumed to be the poor woman's husband came. With a mixture of worry and shame on his face, he approached his wife. "Dorothea, what are you doing? Enough now. Stop," he pleaded. I would later learn that her name was Dorothea Trophea. But the woman paid no heed and continued dancing, or rather writhing. Her husband tried to grab her arms, but Frau Trophia's movements were so uncontrolled and violent that the man lost his balance and staggered backward. While we watched in amazement, the poor woman continued her dance as if nothing had happened. Hours began to pass. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the stone pavements were heating up and the air was becoming heavier. But Frau Trophea would not stop. Sometimes she would stagger from exhaustion and fall to her knees. But after a few breaths, she would get up again and start spinning with trembling steps. The crowd had gradually grown. Some thought this was a crazy spectacle and burst into laughter, while others prayed, "My God, have mercy on her condition." I was frozen in a corner with Katerina, watching. My heart ached. I could see that the woman's ankles were twisted. Her feet were red as if blood had settled. Yet she still danced, as if she had to, as if an invisible hand was pulling and spinning her. At the end of the day, when darkness began to fall, Frau Trophia's strength was completely exhausted. She waved her arms in the air one last time. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed onto the hard stones. Those around her let out a scream. Her husband ran and took his wife's head in his lap. The woman was unconscious. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. She was breathing heavily. Someone from the crowd brought water. Another fanned her with a fan. We also approached, thinking maybe we could help. Katerina's eyes had filled with tears. "Is she dead?" she asked in a trembling voice. I leaned down to look. The woman's pulse was still beating, but very weak. "No, I think she's just tired," I said, as if wanting to calm both myself and my sister. There was a shiver inside me. This woman's dancing almost non-stop from morning to evening was not normal. I looked at her legs. Her feet were swollen. Her shoes were on the verge of falling apart. It was noticed that one of her fingertips was bleeding, and someone pressed a clean cloth to her wound. The neighbors who had gathered there began to help carry the woman to her home. 4 people had difficulty lifting her by her arms and legs from the ground. The woman's body would involuntarily convulse from time to time. Her legs would kick in the air as if dancing even while airborne. Her husband called out in desperation, "Get a doctor. Can someone call the priest?" We also followed them to their home with the crowd. When Frau Trophea was carried inside their house through the threshold, I watched from a distance. The trace that the woman's final state left in my eyes had scattered an indescribable sadness and fear into me. That night, as we returned home, Katerina asked, "Why did this happen, brother? What did we see today?" I had no answer to give. "I don't know," I said simply. "Perhaps we should pray that God protects our minds." She silently nodded. That night, many people in Strasbourg must have lost sleep, because the same terrifying image was in everyone's minds. A woman who danced for no reason and collapsed exhausted. The morning after that day, when we witnessed Frau Trophia's strange seizure, I woke up with a strange anxiety inside me. I was trying to console myself that what we had seen was perhaps a one-time fit of madness. I tried to open my shop and get on with my daily work. However, before the day progressed, a new rumor began circulating in the streets. "That woman is dancing again." When I first heard it, I couldn't believe my ears. It was impossible for the person who had fainted from exhaustion yesterday to attempt to dance again today. I succumbed to my curiosity, entrusted the shutter to Katerina, and hurried to the street where the Trophia's house was located. As I approached, the scene I encountered filled me with horror. Yes, Frau Trophia was in the street again, and dancing, and with greater energy than yesterday. Her face was still pale and sweaty, but her eyes were open, fixed on a point. A more crowded group had gathered around her this time. Her husband was looking around desperately with hopeless eyes, but no one knew what to do. The woman's feet were keeping rhythm back and forth, despite the wounds she had received yesterday. Moreover, this wasn't the only strangeness. In the crowd, I noticed other bodies swaying as if accompanying Frau Trophia. Among the people who had only watched yesterday, some now seemed as if they had been drawn to the stage by an invisible hand, swaying by themselves. First, a young man caught my attention. While standing at the roadside with a water flask in his hand, as if entering a trance, he first began to keep time lightly with his feet. Then his arms loosened and began spinning uncontrollably in the air. We made eye contact for a moment. His vacant gaze was like glass. I don't think he saw me. Then he too surrendered to the rhythm and staggeringly advanced toward the center of the crowd, next to Frau Trophia, dancing. People stepped aside in amazement. Then a scream erupted. God protect us. Look at my daughter. A middle-aged woman was holding and pulling the hand of a young girl beside her. The young girl, however, roughly released her mother's hand, threw herself into the crowd, and began spinning, bending her waist and waving her hands in the air. Clearly, she too had been caught in the same strange dream. Fear and panic were growing among the observers. Some began to pray, some to cry. Several people ran away from there. Perhaps they were afraid that this strange sight would infect them too. While I was frozen in shock, I felt someone grab my arm. Katerina had come to my side, out of breath, asking, "Is this real, brother?" Apparently she too couldn't resist and had left the shop to come here. Go home immediately. I said in panic, "This place isn't safe." But she wouldn't take her eyes off those on the scene for a moment. At that moment, we saw an old man also throw his cane to one side and begin taking strange steps with his trembling legs. Incredible but true, the dancing madness that started yesterday had now spread to several more people. As days progressed, the scene began to take an increasingly frightening turn. Frau Trophia was still dancing. We heard news that she would faint and fall from time to time, then get up again. The number of those dancing with her increased every passing day. By the end of the third day, it was being discussed that dozens of people were dancing day and night in the streets. And this wasn't happening in just one street, but at different points of the city. It was as if a fire had broken out, and sparks were jumping from neighborhood to neighborhood with the wind. People of all ages and from all walks of life were caught by this mysterious epidemic. Porters, bakers' apprentices, beggars, some pilgrims who had come to the city as travelers, young nuns, and even rumors spread that one or two clergymen couldn't control themselves and began dancing like crazy. This was an incredible situation. No one could explain why this was happening, but everyone was gripped by deep fear. I, in the midst of all this chaos, was trying my best to protect Katerina and support her. We had become unable to sleep at night in the face of what we had seen. Katerina would sometimes wake up with nightmares, trembling and saying, "Brother, I hear music in the street. It's as if drums are playing ... I struggled hard to calm her and keep her away from the crisis. But deep down I was shaken with the same fear. What if one of us also gets caught in this trouble? Unfortunately, this fear of mine soon met with reality. At the beginning of August, it was a scorching midday. Katerina and I went to draw water from the well near our house. From outside, a muffled rumble could also be heard. The footsteps and moans of people dancing at various points in the city had now almost become background noise. While we were filling our jugs in the small square where the well was located, I suddenly seemed to hear a familiar melody from afar. This wasn't a real music sound. Perhaps my mind was playing a trick on me, but a faint violin tune seemed to play in my ear. Katerina must have heard this too, because she began to narrow her eyes, and look into the distance. "Did you hear it too?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, like a melody. She said in a distant voice. She put the full water bucket in her hands on the ground. "Katerina?" I called out, sensing something strange. When she turned to me, there was a strange smile on her face. Her pupils had dilated. Her gaze had become distant. An alarm bell rang inside me. "Katerina, what happened?" I said, touching her arm. Without saying anything, she moved away from me and began walking toward the center of the square. "Stop, where are you going?" I said, following her. At that moment, my sister began to spin slowly, as if she really heard that imaginary music. I didn't want to believe it, but Katerina had gradually begun to dance. The skirt of her dress was fluttering in circles. Her bare feet were raising small clouds as they spun on the dusty stone ground. No, please," I said, running to her side. I held her hands. "Katerina, come to your senses." I called out, looking into her eyes. For a brief moment, her eyes focused. Her expression seemed to change. Perhaps she was struggling within herself. But a few seconds later, that misty veil descended over her gaze again. As if she couldn't control her body, she freed her arms from me and continued spinning. I was crying on one hand, struggling to stop her on the other. The neighbors around noticed the situation and gathered around us. Some were muttering, "Oh, poor girl. It has spread to her too." And some were backing away a few steps in fear. "Help me, hold her," I shouted in desperation. 2 neighbor women came and stood in front of Katerina. We caught her by her arms. Despite her delicate appearance, my sister began to writhe with incredible strength when held. Her feet were hitting the ground. She was throwing her body backward, trying to free her arms. 3 people, we were unable to subdue a young girl. Finally came a moment when we all had to stumble and step back. Katerina freed herself and leaped back to the center of the square and continued spinning madly. I rubbed my hands. My wrists ached from her struggle to break free. Let her be, or she hurt herself more," said an old neighbor. I was out of breath, tears streaming from my eyes as I watched my sister's helpless dancing. I had to accept that I couldn't stop her, that she had fallen into the clutches of this curse. My knees gave way, and I collapsed on the sidewalk and began sobbing. I had never felt so powerless and helpless in my life. This incomprehensible dancing epidemic that had been going on for days had now claimed hundreds of people. In the streets of Strasbourg, it was possible to see someone dancing in an exhausted, writhing state at every corner. Some were spinning alone. Some were trying to awkwardly keep pace with each other's movements in small groups. This nightmare that continued day and night, regardless of time, had shattered the sleeping peace of the city. When we looked out of our windows at night, we saw shadows swaying under lantern lights, accompanied by moans and foot-dragging sounds heard from afar. Sleeplessness dominated the entire city. The relatives of those dancing kept vigil, and those who weren't dancing waited on edge with fear. Meanwhile, I too was trying not to leave Katerina's side for a moment. Since my efforts to bring her home were in vain, I found the solution in staying outside, around her like a moth. During the day's heat, I poured water on her head. At night, I covered her with a shawl, trying to keep her from getting cold. When she occasionally collapsed exhausted and fell to the ground, I would take her head in my lap and try to give her a few bites of bread and water, but she didn't even notice these. She drank very little water, ate almost no food. Like many others, Katerina was among those who danced for days hungry and thirsty. I didn't know how long she could endure, and my heart was filled with fear. During these terrible days, Strasbourg's authorities finally took action. At first, no one knew what to do, perhaps hoping it would pass by itself in a short time. However, when cases increased like an avalanche and paralyzed normal life, the city's notables, priests, doctors, and the municipal council began holding emergency meetings. We didn't know exactly what was discussed in these meetings, but various rumors circulated around. We heard that some priests characterized this situation as Saint Vitus's wrath. According to them, somehow the people had not honored the saint enough, or were being punished divinely for some sin. In sermons, some said, Saint Vitus is punishing sinful servants by making them dance. Part of the people flocked to churches to confess their sins upon these words, making vows. Some desperate families even burned incense and recited prayers over their dancing relatives, hoping to remove the evil from them. Others whispered that this was the devil's work, that demons had entered the victims. By word of mouth, superstitions like a black silhouette was seen roaming the streets at night, enchanting people by playing the flute, were even spread. Fear, when combined with ignorance, was turning into irrational tales. On the other hand, the doctors and some sensible administrators in the city were in a rush to find a more worldly explanation. According to the theory of healers, widespread in the medicine of the period, people's blood might have heated up, and therefore they might be caught in this madness. The excessively hot weather had created a kind of feverish vapor in their bodies, and this had driven them to madness. Normally, in such a situation, they would try to treat patients by bloodletting, cutting the vein and letting the hot blood flow to provide relief. However, this time the doctors recommended a different treatment, because similar dancing epidemics had been heard of in the past, and according to records from those times, patients could recover spontaneously by dancing. Yes, though it sounds crazy, the doctors claimed that people afflicted with this dancing disease needed to dance to their heart's content, that if they danced until they exhausted their inner desire, they might perhaps return to normal. The priests opposed this, saying, "Don't provoke them further. This is already a curse." But the city council finally decided to implement the doctor's suggestion. More dancing was deemed appropriate as a cure. This decision was incredible for ordinary people like us, but at the same time, like a ray of hope. Since they're going to dance anyway, let them do it in a controlled manner so they can be exhausted and recover, they said among themselves. Toward the middle of August, frantic preparations began in the center of Strasbourg. By municipal order, large halls belonging to the carpenters and tanners guilds were emptied, their floors cleaned and turned into dance floors. Moreover, arrangements were also made in open areas. Wooden platforms were erected in the wide square used as the city's horse market and in the grain market area. These platforms were prepared like stages, with awnings stretched around them to prevent those dancing under the sun from fainting. Everyone was curiously watching what was happening. As I tracked Katerina from corner to corner, I also witnessed these preparations. I was trying to find consolation by thinking to myself, maybe it will work, because my sister was wasting away day by day, fading before my eyes. If this strange treatment would stop her, we had no choice but to try. Finally, one morning, municipal criers toured the streets and announced, "Those afflicted with the dancing plague shall gather. All patients and their relatives shall be brought to the guild halls at noon. By doctor's orders, music will be played for them." This announcement created both strange excitement and fear. Some people reacted angrily to this idea, complaining, "Dancing is already the source of the trouble. Are they going to dance even more?" But most of us, as if wanting to cling to hope in desperation, were willing to try. That day, I too managed to get Katerina into a horse cart with the help of neighbors when I could catch her at a moment. I was going to take her to one of the guild halls. Maybe they could really help there. Katerina, and many other patients who were brought there with the support of their relatives like me, were taken to the wide hall of the Tanners Guild. The interior of the hall was high-ceilinged and spacious. Normally used as a leather tanning workshop, this place was now emptied and turned into a complete performance venue with spectators and caretakers lined up on the sides. When we entered, I couldn't believe my eyes. About 20 or 30 people on the floor were were spinning around like mad. Some seemed to laugh screaming, some moaned as if crying, but their feet never stopped for a moment. Several strong men from the city guards were waiting along the walls. These seemed to be assigned to lift up anyone who fell and couldn't get up or became too weak. Also, what first caught my attention were the musicians gathered in a corner of the stage. The municipality had hired various musicians for this job. 2 drummers, a flutist, and several lute and violin players were there. They were silent, as if waiting for the given signal. I guided Katerina by her arms toward the dancers. She was already being drawn there anyway. As soon as I let her go, she mixed into the crowd and began spinning on her own axis. Shortly after, an official gave a hand signal, and the musicians began to play. First light drum attacks with rhythm, then violin and others ... Our ears were filled with real music sounds. Normally, when people hear these melodies, they would be delighted, wanting to accompany the dancer. But here, the situation was completely different. Although the melody played was a cheerful song, the atmosphere was heavy. On the faces of the dancers, not joy, but pain and exhaustion could be read. As the music accelerated, their movements seemed to accelerate too. If someone slowed down from fatigue, they would approach and raise their hands in the air for them to keep tempo, and even some healthy volunteers would join them to support them. Yes, I saw with my own eyes. The council had brought not only musicians, but also healthy dancers. These volunteers, perhaps they were paid hirelings, mixed among the patients, keeping them on their feet and encouraging them to spin. It was at that very moment that I understood how insidious the curse was. Some of these assistant dancers, who were brought as healthy, began to behave strangely after a while. There was a young man in a red vest. First, he was cheerfully trying to spin carrying a woman. The woman seemed unconscious. Her feet were dragging. The young man let her go and continued dancing himself. Then the smile on his face disappeared. His movements became sharper and more uncontrolled. It was as if he too had become one of the patients. Another, a middle-aged woman, was first clapping her hands, then suddenly spun madly around herself. Her hair came loose and covered her face. I understood that this disaster was also attracting the healthy who stood nearby. Even among the spectators who were encouraged by the music, there were those who couldn't resist and jumped into the dance floor. The scene that dominated the hall at that moment was incredible. About 50 people in a closed hall were dancing, burning like a blazing flame, spinning round and round with the enthusiasm of drums and wind instruments. This sight filled me with horror. The well-intentioned treatment of the authorities had further fueled the disaster. As the hours progressed, the inside of the hall became like a scorched hell. The temperature rose considerably from the stuffiness and the body heat of people. A dense smell of sweat and exhaustion surrounded the area. The musicians were also exhausted, but they were not allowed to stop playing. They were taking turns playing so that the rhythm wouldn't stop. Because according to a rumor, when the music stopped, the dancers became more angry and hurt themselves. So a constant noise continued. The rumble of drums was echoing in my chest. The high sounds of violins were making my nerves tremble and causing headaches. I was tracking Katerina with my eyes. In that crowd, her dress was soaked with sweat, her hair disheveled, with no sandals left on her feet. She was dancing barefoot and bloody. My heart had become unbearable. Unable to bear it, I advanced toward the dance floor, wanting to try once more with the hope that maybe I could pull her aside. But as I approached, a guard touched my shoulder and stopped me. "Never enter among them. You'll both do yourself wrong and harm them," he said in a serious voice. "But my sister," I protested. The man glanced at the dancers from the corner of his eye. "We all have relatives, son. Be patient." "The doctors have ordered it, so there's no other way," he said. I withdrew angrily. What could I say? They had left us no choice but to bow to authority. That day, I waited for hours in that hall. My eyes remained fixed on the bodies dancing like burning torches. I lost my sense of time. It was as if we had been trapped in a dream. From time to time, several people would collapse to the floor. They would carry the unconscious ones to the side. Immediately, new ones would take their place. A vicious cycle continued. Deep despair began to grow inside me. "This will continue for days like this," whispered another patient's relative next to me. We made eye contact. There was fatigue and horror in the man's eyes. "I don't think so, ... They'll die this way, ... I said pessimistically. Just then, I saw a city council official inside run outside with a horrified expression. Another followed him out, their faces covered with horror. Apparently, they too had seen that the plan wasn't working. Indeed, the dancing epidemic had now reached its peak and was out of control. In the last week of August, Strasbourg was at the very center of an indescribable whirlpool of madness. According to official records, the number of dancers had reached 400. This meant a considerable portion of the city's population. Streets, houses, marketplaces. Everywhere was filled with dancing, writhing, wretched people. The screams and crying sounds rising from different points of the city during the day never ceased. Worst of all, deaths had begun. Young bodies could no longer endure this superhuman exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Every day it was discussed that several people collapsed where they stood and never got up again. According to a rumor, on the most intense days, 15 people died this way per day. Although no one could know the accuracy of the figures, I personally witnessed death stalking with my own eyes. While waiting by Katerina's side, a young man named Hans, our neighbor who was dancing nearby, suddenly collapsed to the ground. I ran to his side. He wasn't breathing. His face was purple. He had given up his soul from exhaustion, and perhaps his heart couldn't bear it. A few people around us also noticed this, and a sad murmur arose. Hans's two relatives ran and came, embraced his body, and took him away. As I watched them go, I saw another woman also sink to the ground just a few meters away. The poor woman was giving her last breath with a thin moan. Her husband, who was holding her, began to wail and cry. These scenes pierced my heart like daggers. Our fellow citizens were dying one by one, visibly, without any war, without any enemy attack. This madness was devastating us. The city council finally understood its mistake. The musical treatment by dancing method had not only completely backfired, it had multiplied the disaster. As soon as they accepted this reality, they urgently took new measures. First, music and dancing were banned everywhere in the city. Yes, you heard correctly. In a place like Strasbourg that was fond of music and entertainment, a complete silence order was given. Playing any instrument, singing in cafes, inns, on the street, was subject to strict penalties. It was even announced that only light string instruments would be allowed at weddings, and rhythmic instruments like drums or zurna absolutely could not be played. This decision would normally have received great reaction from the people, but no one had the energy to rebel anymore. Besides, very few people could think of entertainment in such an environment anyway. Along with the music ban, the dance platforms that had been set up before also began to be dismantled one by one. The shows in guild halls were immediately stopped. I almost dragged Katerina out of the tanner's hall. She still wanted to dance, but her steps had slowed down considerably due to exhaustion. Perhaps for the first time in days, I was seeing some pause in her movements. Because the music inside had stopped, and no tempo sound was heard outside either. The city was enveloped in complete ominous silence. Only occasionally some moaning echoing from street corners. The rustling of a few bare feet scraping against stones could be heard. This silence was not relief, but like a calm before the storm. The administrators, who understood that prohibitions would not be enough, finally found the solution in taking refuge in divine power. As the priests had mentioned from the beginning, it began to be believed that this disaster could only end with St. Vitus's mercy. Already the general opinion among the people had shifted in this direction. The saint's curse is upon us. There's no other explanation, they said. Of course, neither logic nor medicine had been able to provide a cure, so the matter was spiritual. Then it had to be solved spiritually. News spread rapidly that a convoy would be formed from the city and the dancing patients would be taken to St. Vitus's shrine. This shrine was said to be a small chapel dedicated to St. Vitus, located in a mountainous region near the town of Saverne, about 30 miles west of Strasbourg. Years ago, I had heard its name too. St. Vitus was a saint to whom people prayed for intercession, especially for epilepsy or strange nervous disorders. If we pray before this saint's bones, he will lift the curse, it was said. This belief had become our last hope. Large horse carts and yoke cases were arranged for the convoy. They would place the seriously ill patients, meaning those who had been exhausted from days of dancing, but were still stirring, in these carts. Some families volunteered, and some guards and priests would also accompany the journey. Katerina was also in this first caravan. Because she had danced for almost a month and was now reduced to skin and bones. Her legs had become thin. Her cheeks had sunken. Her eyes were closed most of the time, but even when she wasn't standing, her toes were still playing on the ground with a slightly trembling rhythm. When I embraced her and put her in the cart, I couldn't hold back my tears. I carefully placed her on the cart's floor, where blankets were spread. Beside her were 3 other women in a similar semi-conscious state. Some were still swaying as if keeping tempo. Some had dozed from exhaustion. Mothers, fathers, spouses were seeing off their loved ones on the side with prayers. This was like a kind of pilgrimage journey. As if going on a sacred mission, we were filled with hope and fear. The journey would take 3 days. On the first day, in a long caravan formation, we slowly exited the city's stone walls. In front, a priest was walking, humming hymns with a large cross in his hand. Right behind him came the first horse cart decorated with church flags. In total, there were 5 cartloads of patients. I was sitting in the same cart with Katerina. I had no intention of leaving her alone during the journey. In the cart were 2 other patient relatives and a young priest. The priest was constantly making the sign of the cross over the patients while quietly reciting Latin prayers. I knelt by Katerina's bedside and held her hand. I remember the coldness of her hand like it was today. It was ice cold, as if her body had already become like an empty container. "Hold on, my dear sister," I whispered. "It's almost over. You'll be freed from this torment." I didn't know what I believed in myself, but we had no other choice. With all my heart, I was asking for help from St. Vitus. As the caravan progressed, the city was left behind. We turned onto country roads. For the first time, then I felt real silence and peace around me. As the crimson sun of late August was setting on the horizon, we were passing by the edge of the forest. The chirping of birds, the rustling of tree leaves sounded so foreign to one's ears. It was as if I was hearing a world without music for the first time in centuries. Nature's own rhythm had replaced the crazy footsteps we had been exposed to for weeks. I had placed Katerina's head on my knees. One of her hands was still twitching involuntarily from time to time. As my eyes were lost in the distant hills, a star appeared in the sky. At that moment, an indescribable feeling filled me, both deep sorrow and a strange relief. Maybe for the first time, my belief that this would have an end was strengthened. This pain will surely end, I thought to myself, as long as we bear it with patience. When we stopped for the night, we stayed at a small inn by the roadside. While the patients rested in the carts or on mats laid on the floor in the inn, I didn't close my eyes all night by Katerina's side. Outside had cooled. Crickets had started giving concerts. I covered my sister with my own jacket, constantly wiping her forehead with a wet cloth. A miracle happened that night. For the first time, Katerina slept for several hours without stirring. Maybe it was from the fatigue of the journey. Maybe the effect of the curse was weakening. I don't know. But her face was calmer, her breath deeper. I too took advantage of the opportunity and quietly fell asleep for a few hours for the first time, my heart at ease. On the second day, we had started climbing mountain roads. As the cart wheels bumped against stones, the patients moaned. Some had stirred again, shaking as they woke from the jolting. They were calmed again with prayers and soothing words. While the surroundings were covered with lush green trees, a lovely pine scent was coming through the cart window. Katerina's eyes opened slightly at one point. She looked at me, seemed to recognize me. "Brother," came a very faint voice from her lips. I immediately leaned down. "I'm here with you, my dear sister," I said. "Don't be afraid. You'll get better." At that moment, 2 tears slid from her eyes. With a tiny head movement, she seemed to nod, then her eyes closed again. This tiny development made me so happy that I felt hope budding in me for the first time in years. Maybe truly a solution awaited us in these mountains. At the end of the 3rd day, in the evening hours, we reached the mountain church near Saverne. This was quite a desolate place. In the forest, on the slope of a rather high hill, I saw a stone chapel. Around it, there were no people except a few monks and priests. As we approached with the caravan, they began to ring the bell, probably to bless our arrival. It was a light melody that touched my heart. I could no longer hold back my tears, crying without realizing it. Here we are, I thought. The final act of all this ordeal would be performed here. The chapel was small but magnificent. When we entered through its door, we were greeted by candle lights reflecting off stone walls and a smell of incense. The statue of St. Vitus stood in the center on the altar. This wooden statue depicting a young saint held a cross and palm branch in his hands. His face had both a compassionate and serious expression. It was as if he was looking at us saying, "You have finally come, my children. I was waiting for you." The patients were carried inside one by one, some walking, some in arms. Katerina and I and the priest took her by the arm together and led her. Inside, local priests guided us. They signaled us to kneel on the stone floor right in front of the saint's statue. All the patients, even those who continued to tremble, were lined up in front of the altar where St. Vitus's statue was located with the help of the priests. Then a ritual began. First, they placed small wooden crosses in each of our palms. I opened Katerina's cold and limp fingers and placed the cross, helping her close her fingers and hold it tightly. Then, nuns there brought red leather shoes. These red slippers, perhaps specially prepared, were put on the patient's feet. They gently wrapped Katerina's swollen and wounded feet, then put on these red shoes. They sprinkled holy water over and under the shoes and drew the sign of the cross with blessed oil. Meanwhile, Latin prayers were constantly being recited, hymns hummed. The atmosphere was enveloped in heavy incense smoke. Its spicy and sharp smell was dense enough to make my head spin. But I wasn't bothered. On the contrary, this smell and the repetition of hymns seemed to untangle the knots inside me, dispelling the buzzing in my head. The priests were all pleading to St. Vitus in unison, praying with words meaning, "O St. Vitus, forgive these sinful servants. Lift the curse upon them." At the end of each prayer, everyone there would whisper Amen. Most of the patients were in an exhausted state, their heads drooping. From time to time their bodies would shake involuntarily, but perhaps due to the sanctity of this place, no one jumped up and started dancing. There were only those who swayed lightly in their places. I knelt right beside Katerina, supporting her shoulder. My little sister had rested her head on my chest. Perhaps her consciousness wasn't fully clear, but at least she didn't look restless. The prayer session continued for quite a long time. Then the head priest stood up and gave a loud speech in front of the statue. In this speech, in summary, He said that we had incurred St. Vitus's wrath, but his compassion was also great, and if we truly repented and took refuge in him, we would be forgiven. Each of his sentences echoed off the walls, making me tremble while also giving me strength. While he spoke, nuns circulated more incense in their silver censers and passed them over the patients' heads. In the smoke, faces were pale, eyes closed. It was like a collective trance state, but this time a serene trance. For the first time in weeks, people had come together without writhing, without screaming. Finally, perhaps the most important part of the ritual arrived. The head priest signaled for everyone to be silent. Music, hymns, everything stopped. Nothing could be heard except the crackling of candles. The head priest came down from the high altar and began walking in front of the patients. Over each one, he sprinkled holy water from the bottle in his hand and murmured a Latin formula. When it was Katerina's turn, my tears flowed again. The priest, touching my sister's head lightly, said, "Sanctus Vitus, libera hanc famulo." Saint Vitus, free this servant. At that moment, Katerina's body flinched slightly. I held her hand tightly. The priest sprinkled the water and passed by. Katerina took a deep breath, and then the miracle happened. After that momentary flinch, my sister's trembling hands stopped. The twitching of her knees ceased. I looked at her shoulder. It had relaxed. It was as if the tension inside her had been released. Her breathing had become regular. She opened her eyes slightly and looked at me. This time she really looked at me. Her consciousness was in place. She recognized me. I smiled in amazement. "Katerina?" I said in a whisper. In a tired but peaceful voice, she replied, "Brother, it's over, I think." Yes, it was over. Similar reactions were rising from the other patients there. Some were coming to their senses, looking around in bewilderment. Some were beginning to cry profusely. A father, hearing his son say his own name for the first time in months, collapsed to the ground from joy and kissed the earth. Another woman was sobbing, clinging to her husband's hand who hadn't spoken for weeks in madness. It seemed as if St. Vitus's miracle had taken place. The spell of the dancing plague had been broken. An incredible wave of relief spread among us. A murmur of joy and gratitude mixed rose in the chapel. The priests turned their prayers into hymns of thanksgiving. All the patients and we relatives collectively offered our thanks before the statue. Katerina, with my help, stood up and knelt before the statue, opening her hands for prayer. With teary eyes and trembling lips, she was giving thanks. Faced with this sight, I too knelt beside her and gave thanks. At that moment, I felt to my bones that the black cloud that had been hovering over us for months had dispersed. After the ritual, the priests distributed a talismanic necklace and a small St. Vitus medallion to each patient who came, instructing them to wear them so they wouldn't suffer such a misfortune again. I put it around Katerina's neck. On the small round medallion was an engraving of the saint. My sister hugged me through her tears. For the first time in weeks, she was hugging me of her own will. I rested my head on her shoulder. We were both crying, but this time from joy. We immediately sent word to Strasbourg. A messenger brought the good news that a cure for the dancing plague had been found, and the remaining patients should be brought here immediately. After our caravan, several more groups of patients were brought to the shrine the next day and were similarly healed. Within a week, there was no one left in Strasbourg wandering the streets by Gansing. The nightmare had finally ended. When we returned to Strasbourg at the beginning of September, our city was almost unrecognizable. After weeks of chaos, death, and fear, the streets were empty and silent. Not long ago, just a month earlier, the pavements that had groaned with footsteps were now deserted and calm. One morning, Katerina and I stepped out from the threshold of our house. Although my sister had become quite thin, she was happy to be able to walk again. Leaning on my shoulder, she walked slowly. Together, we went to our neighborhood square. We met neighbors we knew. Everyone was asking after each other's health. Those who had recovered from the disease were still weak, but could sit on their own and speak a few words. Funerals had come out of many houses due to the disease. Black cloths were hung on doors to mourn the dead. We too prayed for those we had lost. Perhaps it wasn't recorded in official records, but this dancing plague had cost us dozens of lives. No one could determine exactly how many people had died. However, these painful losses were etched in everyone's memory. The city council ordered that those who had recovered from the disease should be taken better care of for a while longer. Each person returning from St. Vitus's shrine was given food and medicine aid from the city treasury. Moreover, priests regularly visited homes and performed blessing ceremonies with holy water. This spiritual cleansing seemed to erase the traces of evil not only from the patients, but from the entire city. Symbols of St. Vitus were carved on street corners and church doors. He would now be our protective shield. As for the prohibitions, the music and dance ban that was initially imposed continued for a while longer. People were already reluctant to dance, let alone hear music sounds. Any noise that would remind us of drum and zurna sounds was enough to startle us. One evening, when neighbors heard a group of children hitting cans and keeping tempo while playing, they panicked and said, "Don't do that," to silence them. This trauma had left deep marks in our memory. The municipality finally relaxed the prohibitions toward the end of October, when the situation in the city had completely returned to normal. Still, in a circular written by a respected member named Sebastian Brandt, it was advised that the people should avoid group dancing, especially staying away from loud entertainments with instruments. This was perhaps to prevent giving occasion to the same thing again. Who knows, maybe there was still fear that this disaster could relapse. As months passed, Strasbourg began to heal its wounds. Katerina recovered her health day by day. While she walked with difficulty at first, toward spring, she seemed to find her old energy again. Only the once lively girl who loved to dance was gone, replaced by a more calm, more thoughtful young woman. Sometimes when we went for walks by the river together, I would notice her becoming lost in thought. Once I asked softly, "What's going through your mind?" She turned to me and smiled slightly. "My feet. I'm still thinking whether they sometimes move involuntarily," she said. "Don't worry. It's all past," I said resolutely. Yes, it had passed. But still, both of us sometimes lived through those nightmare days in our dreams at night. When Katerina woke up startled from her sleep, I would stroke her hair and sing lullabies to her. For both of us, finding true peace again would take time. The city people continued to tell this story from mouth to mouth. This strange dancing epidemic was unlike anything we had heard from our ancestors before. Some said they had heard that similar things had been seen in different lands in history. It was even told that in 1374, a great dancing madness had occurred along the Rhine River banks, and people had perished dancing madly in the streets. What we experienced was perhaps the most violent and most incredible version of those old stories. The effort to make sense of what happened continued for months. Theories were produced in Strasbourg about why this had befallen us. Doctors shamefacedly defended their previous blood-heating theories, but the people didn't pay much attention to them anymore. A group of people suggested that there was a poisonous mold in the rye flour in the bakeries, that we had hallucinations and went mad because of the bread we ate. Some thought this disaster was the work of a secret sect. An irreligious group in the city, so-called devil worshippers, had collectively lost themselves and danced, dragging others after them. However, such rumors found no concrete evidence. Besides, we victims felt that our own experience didn't fit such explanations. We had experienced neither just a bodily ailment like poisoning, nor was this a faith ritual. It seemed to be something deeper, penetrating to the marrow of the soul. Years later, around 1526, a famous physician named Paracelsus came to the city. He had heard the fame of this strange case and wanted to investigate it. I remember he spoke with several of us survivors. He brought his own explanations. Supposedly, the first woman to dance, Frau Trophea, had pretended to anger her husband, and the women who imitated her had also danced to anger their husbands, putting forward such a strange theory. Paracelsus attributed this event to women's luxury and lust addiction, and attempted his own classifications. When I heard this, I laughed bitterly to myself. What great injustice it was to reduce the indescribable fear, helplessness, and pain we had experienced to such a simple and degrading cause. But anyway, no one took Paracelsus's words seriously. After he left the city, he left behind only confusion. Today, years having passed, I still shiver when I think of the summer of 1518. It's difficult even to put what we experienced in those days onto pages. This event led me to question many things I knew about humanity. How much control do we have over our own bodies? Can our minds be so easily caught up in others' hysteria? Can emotions like hunger, famine, fear drive us collectively mad? Perhaps yes. When I remember Strasbourg's misery of that period, I think this disaster was like an explosion point. Years of endured hunger, epidemic diseases, war threats, poverty. There are those who say that all this accumulated stress finally became too heavy for people's minds, and a kind of collective trance state was experienced. Perhaps the name of St. Vitus was just a symbol. The real curse was in our inner world. We believed that if we didn't worship a saint enough, we would be punished by being made to dance, and finally, what we feared happened to us. So we created our own nightmare ourselves. Although these explanations seem reasonable, no one knows the real truth. I still remember that strange glitter in my sister's eyes that day, that vacant expression on her face while she was being tossed around against her own will. I have difficulty understanding how a person can completely lose themselves. But she did, and hundreds of them did. So this thing called reason is just a balance hanging on a cotton thread. When our balance is disturbed collectively, such incredible results can emerge. As the people of Strasbourg, we never forgot this event we experienced. A plaque was hung on a wall of our church for those who lost their lives in the 1518 dancing epidemic. Every year, on St. Vitus's feast day, both those victims are remembered, and thanks are offered to the saint. In the past, we would remember this event with fear mixed with panic. Now we consider it a precautionary and instructive occasion. There were also fundamental changes in our culture. For a long time, no one wanted to dance openly. Even at weddings, the bride and groom would just spin around a bit as tradition dictated. Everyone behaved moderately. Over time, fears subsided, of course. Human memory tends to forget. As years passed, new generations came to listen to this story like a fairy tale. But those like me saw firsthand how dance could turn into death in those streets. We didn't forget. As I write these lines, Katerina is beside me, telling fairy tales to her own children. Isn't it funny? The fairy tale she's telling is also about the dancing village. It has even become a folk legend inspired by our story. My little nephews are listening with laughter, wondering, did people really dance non-stop, Aunt? Katerina winks and says, yes, but they recovered in the end. I'm leaning against the windowsill, listening to them. My eyes are lost in the distance again. Several young people in our street are running around cheerfully. One has started a melody with whistling. Although a slight uneasiness stirs inside me, then I come to my senses by smiling. There's nothing to fear. The melody continues, and I too am tapping my foot to the rhythm. Life has returned to normal, and music has once again managed to be our source of joy. Sometimes I think that perhaps all these experiences were a lesson for us. A bitter lesson advising us to take good care of each other, not to be prisoners of fear. The streets of Strasbourg groaned with the screams of dancers that summer. The stones were stained with their blood. But now children are playing hopscotch in those streets. Young people are playing flute in the evening market, and people are dancing again. Yes, they're dancing willingly, joyfully. This is perhaps an indication that life goes on. When night falls, Katerina and I sometimes look at the sky and watch the stars. In those dark days, we had even forgotten the existence of stars. Yet now how calmly and eternally they shine. Katerina holds my hand and says, "Come on," like we used to do when we were little, and spins around gently. While gliding on her tiptoes, I too join her steps. Although a slight shiver passes through me, it disperses when I see her smiling face. With a silent melody, two siblings are slowly dancing under the stars. This time no force is tossing us around against our will. Every step is our choice, every turn our joy. The mysterious event, known as the dancing plague of summer 1518, will continue to remain an enigma in our minds. Perhaps future generations will try to solve its secret. Perhaps they'll write legends. But what's important for me is that I was able to bring my loved ones out of that disaster alive and reach calm days again. Now, when I open my window at night in Strasbourg, I hear occasional laughter from afar. Perhaps there's a small celebration in a house. My heart fills with peace. May we have many nights when people dance with their own will, with happiness, but may God never again force us into a cursed dance.